Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y bienvenidos al
Good
webinar
morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Generation of
de la serie Estrategias para promover
Land for
ciudades
Social Housing in Cities.
Camila Uribe
I
para
am Maria
presentarles
Camila
el
Uribe.
informe
I am
base o
a
directrices básicas
coordinator
para el
for
conocimiento
the
sobre cómo mejorar el
IDB
aprovechamiento del
Cities
suelo
program.
interurbano
We're
para
going to
promover
talk about how to take advantage of intra-urban land for social housing. Before we start, the webinar will be in Spanish,
pueden oírlo en inglés
so
o
you
portugués
can
para
hear
los
it
miembros
in
de la comunidad
English
hispana y
or
aquellos que lo quieran.
Portuguese. For those of
Solamente
you
deben
who
ir
choose to
en el
do
icono
so,
del mundo
you
en la
only
parte
have to
inferior de su
click
pantalla y escoger el link de
in the
participación.
small globe that you will
And you
find
will
at the
that you will
bottom
here in the
of the
symbol of the
screen.
world down on your screen. And você pode escolher o idioma de su preferencia no símbolo do mundo na parte de abaixo del menú. En caso de tener una pregunta para los panelistas,
Should you have a
pueden agregar
question
la
for the
sección de
panelists,
Q&A
add it in the Q&A
acá en la plataforma. Los
in the
panelistas
platform.
responderán
The
las
panelists
preguntas de la
will
audiencia
answer
en
the
el
audience's
espacio final de la sesión.
question at the end of the session.
Además, recordarles que la grabación de esta sesión estará
Furthermore,
disponible en el canal de
the
YouTube de
recording of
Improvinglives
this session will be
también
available in the
en el
YouTube
canal de
channel we
IDB
have
a
in the
partir de la
IDB
próxima semana y
channel
también aquí
beginning
pueden
next
encontrar
week.
nuestro
And you can
link
find
en el chat.
our link
Para
in the
quienes
chat.
se unen por primera vez,
For those of
les
you
quiero
who joined for the
representar las
first time,
ciudades del BID. Es una
the
plataforma
Cities
regional enfocada
Network
a
for the
facilitar la
IDB
intercambio de conocimientos, soluciones y buenas
platform,
prácticas
regional
entre
platform
ciudades
to
de Colombia y
facilitate
del Caribe.
knowledge
Cada
exchange,
una tiene
solutions, and
distintas
best
sectoriales de
practices
desarrollo
among
urbano.
Latin American and
Esta oportunidad
Caribbean
es de diálogo con
cities.
los
It
diferentes
generates
actores del sector
dialogue
público,
opportunities
privado,
among
académico,
different
con
IDB
más de
divisions
250
and the public,
ciudades
private, and
participadoras.
academic sector.
También
It
aprovechamos el
contributes
conocimiento
to
de los panelistas.
strengthening leadership in
De
urban
igual manera, lo que
management.
buscamos es contribuir
What
al
we want is to
fortalecimiento de la
contribute
gobernanza
to
urbana,
strengthening
a la construcción de capacidades para los funcionarios municipales
capacities
y a
for
la promoción
municipal
del trabajo
agents
estratégico con
and driving
instituciones
its,
allied.
its synergy between
Si
allied
tienen más
institutions.
información sobre la red
For
o para
further
inscribirse en sus
information on the
ciudades, pueden
network or to sign up,
agregar este link que estamos
you
compartiendo
can
con
use
ustedes
the link that
en
we
el
are
chat.
sharing in
Bueno,
the chat.
con respecto a los
Now,
eventos
regarding the
que hacemos
webinars,
este año, tenemos 4 series de
this
webinars.
year
La
we
primera
have
hicimos la
4
primera
webinar
sobre
series.
las
We did
ciudades
the
de
first
América
one
Latina y el
on
Caribe
Latin
después del
American and
COP como
Caribbean cities
referencia
after the
y acción climática
COP as drivers of
del
climate
coronavirus.
action.
Este
We
año, la
finished
segunda
that one
serie
already. The second one
tenemos a
is
los
this one
abogados
that we
del
are doing
segundo
right
webinar
now. This is the
sobre
second
vivienda social en
webinar
ciudades de América
on
Latina y el Caribe.
social housing in
Luego
Latin American and
tenemos una
Caribbean
serie
cities.
en septiembre
Then we will have a series in
que haremos
September
sobre estrategias para enfrentar la polución en ciudades de América Latina y el
with
Caribe. Y
strategies to
finalmente en
address
octubre
pollution in
tenemos
Latin American and
otra
Caribbean
serie
cities.
y la última.
And
Hablaremos sobre las estrategias
then we
para
will talk
biodiversas y
about
resilientes en
strategies
América
for
Latina y el Caribe,
biodiverse and
aprovechando
resilient
la
cities in
conferencia
Latin
que
America
nos
and
espera
the
en la región.
Caribbean.
Para recibir las invitaciones
To get
y
the
los links de
invitation
registro de
and
estas
the
series, no olviden suscribirse
registration
al
links, don't
newsletter de la
forget
red
to sign up to
con
the
el enlace
network's
que se puede
newsletter
encontrar acá
with
en
the
el chat.
link that you will
Y
find in the
también
chat
allí
as
pueden
well.
encontrar los blogs
And there
relacionados
you
con los
can see
temas
blogs
como todos en la
related
página web de ciudades
to
sostenibles.
these
Ahora
topics
sí,
on sustainable cities.
hablemos un poco
Now
sobre
let's
el webinar
start
de hoy.
and let's talk about today's
Hoy tengo
webinar.
una conversación sobre los
Today we will
desafíos
have a
en
conversation on the
Latin America y el
challenges
Caribe en la
in
lucha
Latin
contra los
America and the
riesgos
Caribbean
sociales
in
de
the
desertificación
struggle
urbana. Los
against
déficits habitacionales
social exclusion.
afectan a más de 55
This
millones
affects more than
y cuando
55
decimos
million
cerca del
households,
45%
which
de la
represents
población total.
45% of the total
Vemos que hay más de
population.
105
We
millones
see
de
that
personas
more
en
than
la región
105 million
viven
people in the
actualmente en barrios
region
informales. A través
live
de
in
esta serie
informal
de
neighborhoods.
estrategias para
Through this
promover la vivienda
series,
social en ciudades de
strategies
América
to
Latina y el
promote
Caribe, abordaremos estrategias para avanzar en
this,
la
we will
planificación
address
urbana,
strategies
para la
to move forward with
redensificación,
urban planning,
generación de bancos
for
de suelo y
redensification,
adquisición de subsidios
generating
para la
land
vivienda
banks
social en
and
ciudades.
subsidies
En
for
nuestro
housing in the
prólogo
cities.
hablaremos sobre la
In
generación
today's
de suelo
webinar, we will
accesible
talk about
para esta vivienda
generating
social en ciudades. Abordaremos la importancia de
accessible
generar y
land,
desarrollar
and
bancos de
we will
suelo
talk
y
about
predios públicos para
land
facilitar la
banks
construcción de
and
vivienda social.
public land
La
for
inserción
social
y desarrollo
housing.
de
the
y bancos de suelo son esenciales
building
para
soil
el acceso a
banks
la vivienda
and
asequible y de
funds is
calidad para la
essential
generación de
for
nuevos ingresos,
social
especialmente en
housing
zonas donde la
for low-income
disponibilidad de
people,
suelo es
especially in urban
limitada o los
areas where
precios son elevados.
land
Y estos
availability is
fondos o
limited
bancos
and prices are
permiten
high.
a
These
los
funds
desarrolladores
or banks
urbanos reducir costos de adquisición de terrenos,
allows
haciendo
to
los
reduce
proyectos de
cost
vivienda
of
más
land,
eficientes y
making
accesibles
housing
para los
projects more
compradores o potenciales
affordable
inquilinos.
and
Los bancos de
accessible
suelo
for
y predios públicos
buyers.
también permiten a los gobiernos
Land
asignar
banks
recursos
allow
estatales para
governments to
vivienda social
manage
a
state
través del Plan de
land
Desarrollo
for
Urbano
social
Planificado
housing,
y Sostenible.
guaranteeing
En la
organized and
sesión de hoy se
sustainable
presentarán casos
housing.
de ciudades de
Today,
Costa
we
Rica
will
y
see
Ecuador
cases
que
from
nos
Costa
ilustrarán sobre
Rica
las
and
soluciones.
Ecuador who will discuss
Esperemos que
this
estas experiencias
topic.
sirvan de
Hopefully,
inspiración
these
para buscar soluciones
experiences will
efectivas que mejoren la
inspire
calidad
you
de
to
vida de las
find
ciudades y
solutions
de la
for
salud de nuestra
a
región.
better quality of
Para
life
abordar
in
entonces estos temas
cities. To
tenemos en
address
estructura
these
la sesión de
topics,
hoy
we
en
have
dos
structured
paneles.
the session in two parts.
Comenzaremos con un panel
We
de
will start
conversación con
with a
expertos para profundizar
panel
sobre la
of
relevancia de la
experts to talk
planificación
about the
urbana
relevance
y la
of
densificación
planning
urbana.
and urban
Contaremos con la
redensification.
participación de
We
Álvaro
will
Porcuna,
have
que es el
Alvaro
director de ciudades y
Porcuna. He's
comunidades
the
inteligentes del grupo
director of
América Móvil, director de
Intelligent Cities and
capacitación de vivienda
Communities for
y desarrollo
America
urbano.
Mobile.
Y tendremos también a Natalia
And we will
Valencia,
have
director
Natalia
de
Valencia,
estructuración de la
Deputy
Agencia
Director
Nacional
of
Inmobiliaria de
Structuring
Colombia.
of the
En la segunda
National
ronda
Agency,
tendremos dos casos.
National Real Estate Agency
Entrevistaremos a Diego
from
Aulesia,
Colombia.
que es jefe
In the
de la
second
Brigada de
part, we will
Settlements
have
Humanos de
Diego
la CIMAC,
Aulesia. He
quien
is
nos va a
the Chief
contar el caso del
of
Banco de
Human
Desarrollo Urbano
Settlements
de San José,
Unit
Costa Rica. Y tendremos
for
también a María
CEPAL
Cristina Gómez
from
Jurado,
Costa Rica, and we will have
gerente
Maria
general de la
Cristina
empresa
Gomez
pública
Jurado,
metropolitana de
General
Hábitat y
Manager
Vivienda
of
de Ecuador, quien nos va a contar el
Habitat
caso
and
ecuatoriano. Y
Metropolitan
finalmente
Housing
comenzaremos con una
for
sesión
Ecuador.
de espacio
Then we
abierto
will
de
finish
preguntas recibidas en
with
el chat
a
y los esperamos
Q&A
escuchar a
to
los
answer the questions
presentadores y
in the
hacer
chat.
las
Please listen to
preguntas
the
para
speakers
profundizar
and
mucho más los temas que son de su interés.
post your
Hoy
questions.
nos acompaña como
Today,
moderadora
as a moderator, we
una
have
especialista senior en
Paloma
planeación de vivienda y desarrollo urbano.
Acevedo.
Queremos
She's a
darle
senior
la bienvenida
specialist
a
in
Paloma
the
y tendremos
housing
también para el
sector. We
cierre de la
welcome
sesión
Paloma, and to
a
close
Paloma
the
Silva,
session,
quien es
we will have
especialista
Paloma
en
Silva,
medición también en
who
temas de
belongs
vivienda
to the housing
y ciudad.
division.
Así que sin más, les
Without
dejo y le
further
dejo a Paloma
ado,
bienvenida
I
y
leave you with
muchísimas
Paloma.
gracias.
Paloma, welcome and
Antes
thank
de
you.
pasar a la sesión,
Before we start with the
me
session,
parece importantísimo
I think
acordarnos de
it
hacer
would
las
be
preguntas
important to
en el inicio
remember
y
to
así
ask,
muy rápido
to
para
answer these
empezar la
questions.
conversación.
So to start the
Me gustaría
conversation,
pedirles que escaneen el código de
please
barras
scan this
para hablar sobre cuáles son los beneficios que generan los bancos
QR
de
code
tierra
to know what are the benefits generated
en
by
las
the
zonas
soil
urbanas que son más
or
densas,
land
en
banks
ciudades
in
en donde se
dense
tienen
urban
bancos, de
areas,
cuál es el beneficio
or what is
que
the
ustedes
benefit
identifican
that
en los
you
bancos de suelo en
identify
áreas urbanas
with
densas.
land
Y los
banks
invito entonces
in
a que escaneen el código de barras y me
overpopulated
digan
urban
qué les
areas. Please
significa
scan the QR code
y darnos su
and
opinión
give
un
us your
poco de
opinion.
la conversación. Movilizar suelo vacante, suelo asequible, suelo servido, frenar
Accessible
especulación,
land,
planificación.
stop speculation, planning, market
Entonces vamos a comenzar.
regulation, affordable prices,
Bueno, creo que ahí hay varias ideas muy interesantes.
well, we see very interesting ideas.
Seguirlas llenando. Si escanean el código.
Please scan the
Y vamos entonces a
QR
nuestra
code.
segunda. ¿Cuáles son los
And let's move
principales
on to the
desafíos
second one. What are the main
de
challenges
generar suelo para vivienda social
of
en áreas urbanas
generating
densas? ¿Cuáles son
land
esos desafíos
banks
que son
for social housing
dificultades
in
en las que tenemos
dense urban
para
areas?
generar
What are the
bancos de
challenges
suelo
or
para vivienda social en áreas
difficulties
urbanas
we
densas?
have?
El costo del suelo, de nuevo escanear el código,
So let's
primer desafío.
scan the code again. That's the first challenge.
Disponibilidad, intereses privados,
Availability, private interests,
adecuada,
introduce utilities, land cost, management, cost, availability.
Bueno, creo que con estas dos preguntas, Paloma,
Very well, I think that with these two questions, this is a good beginning. So you have the floor. Thank you, Maria Camila. Good morning to the 270 people who are with us from Latin America and Europe. We are going to start the first part of the webinar with two experts, with two land use or soil use experts. Álvaro belongs to the America Mobile group, and he's an international consultant. Good morning, Álvaro.
Encantado.
Hi, good morning. Álvaro, we have two questions for you. First of all, based on your experience on cities of the future, the land banks, how can they face the specific challenges in highly dense cities, especially because of land price? Well, thank you. Regarding cities of the future, we're talking about the ones that we are creating now. I think that cities of the future are being planned today, and the challenges of those cities are high competition for land. Many of the answers were in the survey that you just did. There's high competition for land, speculation, cost, scarcity. So in highly densified cities, there is a consolidated market, prices are defined, we have utilities, and the advantage is that it favors social integration. That is one of the most important things in terms of social housing. Although this situation in many Latin American cities, and even though I have an accent, I've worked for many years in Mexico, Central and South America, this is not so regular. Centralization, or the main point, is not the value. The concept of suburbs is very rooted in Latin America, and prices are not only related to the geographical location. So there is an opportunity for land banks to buy land in areas around the city that have that same problem: land prices, utilities, etc. So it is true that it is difficult to buy land with your own funds, but if we have the correct regulation, we can buy land with private entities who are the owners of that soil or that land. I was saying that we need to create new centralities or downtowns. I don't want to digress from the topic. Of course, land banks have problems to buy land in the central part of the city, but they can also create them with the private sector. Many times we find that downtown is obsolete, or the city is not prepared to receive more population. And along with the local administrations who are in charge of local planning, we can work on specific land reserves for social housing with consolidated urban land, as we do it in Spain. In Spain, there is a reserve that allows land banks to get capital with assignments. For example, land that goes from rural to urban, I think now it is like 40%, and 10% of reforming consolidated land. So the land banks can play with the strategy of moving buildings that are obsolete, for example, military buildings or state buildings, so that the banks can work on social housing. A key is an association with the private sector, because the banks sometimes don't have the financial muscle to develop land, even though they do have the land. Here we talk about social renting. What are we going to do? Give the land to private developers, or are we going to sell it at a low price so that it is competitive? We also have the issue of land assignment, because if you give a land concession for 75 years, it is almost your property, and there you can have social housing. That's one of the biggest problems we have in Europe, especially in Spain, but also in Latin America. I think that social renting needs to be driven. And I think I'm touching on all of those topics. I don't know if I'm not being very organized because of the question, because that question has so many answers, but land banks need to work hand in hand with local authorities to create land equity, and that they can promote this with the private sector. I always give an example, the example of the Bilbao's revitalization. This began in the year 2000, but this was a consensus among all of the public offices. The port participated. Then we were able to invest in purchasing new lands. Industrial land was also part of the solution, and it was not only a housing project, it was to revitalize the economy, to have 21% of people unemployed in the 80s, and then in the 90s we only had a residual unemployment. The public-private cooperation, the strategic use of land, the reserves, the land reserves through planning, innovation in the property models, long-term land concessions, using industrial land to turn it into social housing. All of that is our solutions. Well, Alvaro, you really answered our question, and you answered part of the second question I had for you. So I wanted to ask you if briefly you could tell me, given the context of Bilbao and other European cities that you have mentioned, and your knowledge of Latin America, what is the main lesson learned that we could use in terms of management and development of land funds? Could you highlight one or two relevant areas, please? Well, I think that the important thing here, well, lessons learned in Latin America, very powerful things are being done. I was working in Peru and Panama with an IDB team, and I see that people are curious, and I see innovation, and I think innovation is key. We have to innovate with management, and then public land operators cannot be only municipal. All of the government entities need to participate to achieve a public-private participation. We need to have a powerful operations model with the public and private sector, governance that includes all of the state representatives, with a finance model per project. It can be with seed capital or with capital from the government, and then with using land management. I thought it was very innovative what was done in Mexico in 2010 with the development of certificates where they propose subsidies so that the developer would build the way they have to build. Well, thank you, Alvaro. Let's remember that you can ask your questions in the chat, and the last part of the webinar will be to read some of the questions to answer them. Next, I would like to invite Natalia Valencia. She is a Deputy Director of the Real Estate National Agency in Colombia. Hi, Natalia. How are you doing? Could you confirm that Natalia is present? Because I cannot hear her. Could someone confirm? Now I see Natalia. Hi, Natalia. Apologies. Natalia, I wanted to ask you two questions. The first one is, have you seen an innovative trend in terms of land management that you could share with us? Well, one of the things that happened in Latin America, in spite of redensification, is that there is enough land to put together the land bank. We have public land in Bogota, for example, because first, the land that belongs to the state and that land that is not developed is a good amount of land. Also, we have some remainders of public land. Historically, the government has acquired that land in different places in the city, in the implementation of land banks. Another thing in this country is that here land is seized because of illegal activities. So when we see what the city has, we find that there is public soil, but that is a constant in Colombia. There is public land, so consolidating the land banks should start by using this real estate. And we have a situation that is that it's not only to manage the real estate, it's not only to put together the public assets. This means how are we going to use that land? How do we mobilize that land? And that is an important issue. Who manages and what is the competence of the actor who manages that real estate? So when we talk about managing land banks, it's not only to put together an inventory. In our cities, we do have it, but what do we do with that real estate? Who will manage that real estate? So that is the first part, because the interesting thing is how do we mobilize those real estates? How can we turn them into housing? And doing that is not so easy, it's not so clear, and we require entities to lead these processes. Here in Colombia, we've been thinking about that, and in the entity where I work and other entities in charge of developing this type of processes, they have begun their strengthening processes, not only to manage real estate, but also to design projects to turn land in housing. other situations that we see on the day-to-day to manage that real estate. There is a regulation at the national level and at the municipal level in terms on how to move, how to work with that real estate. Some housing law reads that the municipalities and the departments can transfer for free that real estate to the municipalities. But we need to see how that gets done, how that real estate becomes available for the projects. We have accounting issues and other topics that need to be solved because many times we just only get the headline, but when we want to do the project, we find situations that make management difficult. Innovation is to take this real estate and make them part of the bank. So what we want is the assets to generate some profit. The profit would be social profit in terms of the amount of housing. So the assets in the land bank cannot be idle. They cannot stay in the banks idle. In our countries to have public empty buildings, and they can be, we, we, we run the risk of squatters, and sometimes it can be more expensive to have those buildings than to use them. So we need innovation. How can we use what we already have, and how do we profit from them? Land acquisition should be strategic. We don't want to have all of the soil around the city because in our Latin American cities, having a lot of land to expand the city generates great expenses. One, because we invest in idle land, and managing that real estate can be expensive. So if we acquire land, it should be strategic acquisition with defined schedules and with very defined goals that tells us in the short, mid, and long term how we're going to transform that land. So that is my input on that topic. Thank you, Natalia. Your answer was so complete that you answered part of the second question that I have for you. So again, I would like to ask you to briefly highlight what are the main strategies that you're talking about. What would you recommend to local governments to maximize the use of public land for social housing without compromising the urban and fiscal assets? Well, I should start by saying that one of the most important assets municipalities have to do with land, but land and land management. If we see a cost structure for a project, if you have land, the regulation and management, you have 25% of the project. That is not, I mean, that's something to take into consideration. If I start the business with 25% of the project, I am an important partner, and I am a partner that can state conditions for the project, and understanding that becomes a very powerful tool to mobilize the real estate that we have. So that implies having active agencies that can lead the transformation processes for the city. And then we should have a slogan that we've been working on, and that is that public management should go from planning to doing. And that implies that the asset needs to be mobilized. We need to turn it into housing because in the end, what has happened, and after the analysis we have performed in Colombian cities and in Latin America, is that in fact, there is a lot of public soil that is idle for a long time. And they have an interesting condition. Many of those lands are really well located because they are in central areas, because they are around transportation infrastructure, and because this would allow having policies in two senses. One, inclusion of these vulnerable populations in central areas, and resilience and climate adaptation. Let's use the built city and let's stop expanding the city. What has happened in Latin America and many intermediate cities is that, for example, urban density has decreased and the urban stain has grown. Instead of having 100 housings per hectare, which should be adequate according to the considerations by habitat, that is going down. And we have cities with 25 houses per hectare, and that generates urban liabilities. So our most important asset, we have it in our real estate and it can be used. With what measures? We should have some specific criteria to develop that. And what should they be? To generate what the market doesn't generate. And what is that? Social housing and public infrastructure. And if you are the partner with 25%, you get to give conditions. Of course, we need to have the private and the public sector to have resources, but also public and communities, because another thing that we should do is to organize the demand. And for example, in our Latin American countries, where we have this idea that we have to use subsidies to finance housing, well, that could be done with other type of projects. And the other thing that I would like to highlight, as Alvaro said before, is that this is useful to develop policies that are obsolete, which are the renting policies, because renting continues to be the most important way to have housing in Latin America. In Bogota, renting can be above 50%, and the renting public policies, not owners policies, renting policies are non-existent. So that is really important. We would talk about not only land banks, but also real estate banks, because another characteristic that we have in Latin America is that our urban census have a high amount of abandoned buildings, which generate deterioration conditions that are important. And if we have a stronger policies in terms of the economic and social dynamics that we have in the cities, to incorporate them, develop them, to fix them, to redo them or reuse them, that would be useful. And that requires the strengthening, the institutional strengthening, and the generation of public operators who can generate regulation and to manage the real estate, generating projects where we can see what the city requires. We're talking about social housing.
Thank you, Natalia. I will have the slogan of going from planning a city to making a city. Please remember, if you have any questions for Natalia, you can write them down on the chat box. And now we're going to go to the second part of a seminar. Right now, we're going to see the presentation of two cases, study cases. First, we have Diego Aulestia. He's the head of the Unidad de Asentamientos Humanos of CEPAL, and he's going to talk about the San Jose de Costa Rica's case. Good morning, Diego. We cannot hear you. We do see you, and we can see your presentation. Good morning, Paloma. Can you hear me? Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you, and big thanks to the Inter-American Development Bank. And it is a pleasure to be here to talk about something that is fundamental. the coincidence there is of the importance. And I know that you are the bank, we coincide in that interest with CEPAL to highlight the importance and the need to work on urban soil. Coincidentally, you said at the beginning about the land bank, and I found it very interesting. And I'm going to talk about how we can move forward in these topics. Here you can see what is the view in the region. Here we have the objectives and the missions of the responsible agencies of urban development and housing in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have made a difference between these two regions. And that's why I brought this, that only in the Caribbean, in a secondary place here where we have the land, but talking about the mission of these institutions that are responsible for this in Latin America, we don't have land as one of the main concerns according to what you have in this mission and vision. So this is the first consideration. I think these debates and exchanges go into the need to introduce systematically and structurally the as the reason of being of for the institutions that are responsible about this. I would just mention that we should not forget about these things in 2030. In Latin America, we will have over 85% of the people living in urban areas. So the lack of offer of land is something fundamental. It is also structural for the development of Latin American cities. Here, my colleagues have talked a little bit about this. I would like to talk about the characteristics and the scope of the meaning of land banking, maintenance and acquisition, and also distribution. That approach of distribution introduces something that is fundamental because we're saying distribution for what? To improve something, to get to some places. It is an instrument, a mechanism. But what we need to be clear about is that it has to be clear to that is going to bring us to a desired scenario. And of course, it is the permanent challenge to go. This is a vision that is regional. I am not going to go into the detail, and I'm not going to deep into that. So talking about Costa Rica, this is something that was led by Marcela Roman in San Jose del Costa Rica consulting team. She was responsible for carrying out this study, and we will see the reflections that allowed us to that generated this. First thing, this is one of the first discussions is that there is public land. Yes, there is. So long as we are considering the land that is the property of the state in various levels, not just at the central level, but also decentralized. This is also from the financial institutions that are part of this state. The classification of these levels. It is not just the land that is the property of the municipality or the one that belongs to the Ministry of Housing, and it is also clearly scattered around, and that is one of the biggest challenges we have. So yes, we have assets, and this is land that is public. So the exercise we did in San Jose, Costa Rica was a methodology because in my previous slide in several countries in Latin America, you say that no, not very short, long ago actually, but we talk about the land bank. But the other challenge is to bring that to execution, to create them. We're talking about a responsible institution of these things. So different institutional arrangements, and that is always going to depend on the local context. So in San Jose, from the information and using analysis techniques, we compile the information, which in itself is a very important job collecting the information from various entities. Because as I said before, the information is really scattered around. We use three filters identifying the properties, verifying the basis conditions, and also checking the data to try to understand if the land is susceptible of being used, in this case, for housing projects, which is what we were interested in. There are studies. These colleagues from the bank have brought very important studies in San Jose, and there we have a consideration from some guidelines regarding the methodology to get to a desired goal, so that we can work on this to have an evaluation matrix in consolidated areas and run some type of classification of the properties depending on the importance of the offer. And this, I'm going to say this very quickly, identifying the lands, considering the physical and special places of the characteristics of the property, regulatory aspects, and also some aspects that are related to basic infrastructure, from characteristics of mobility, equipment, and all different characteristics that applying some weight of the relative importance that, of course, we have clarity that ends up being subjective, and it does not reflect where we want to go, what we are assessing. In this case, of course, we are giving some specific value to this public land. So applying this criteria to the inventory, we had a tool that we could get to very quickly. You can see the pictures here. This is the central area of San Jose where we worked on. And here you can see, for example, this parking space that is like 2 or 3 blocks away from the park. And of course, these are central areas of the city, which are consolidated and where you can develop different types of equipment, of constructions. The priority could be or should be housing, especially social interest housing. But of course, we can have different constructions. And the third dimension was to understand the legal framework to create the strategy. So starting a land that was idle, that was infravalued, undervalued. And here we have something that is not formalized. We have some practices, but it is necessary to give structure or some type of orientation that's been used before for developing constructions. That Costa Rica is one of the biggest countries that has generated the biggest numbers of social interest constructions, but clearly that is less and less a trend, and we need to change that again or go back to that. A fourth dimension that is it the possibility to use them for social housing. I think, yes, we have some public land and we need to use it, and we need to increase the offer of social interest housing, even though the demand is going down. New regimes for holding this land. In Latin America, we have reduced over 4 points housing, and that is one of the biggest trends, I think, for the last decade in the housing market in the cities, but also make it compatible to the challenges of management, which are not minor, and their understanding what are the institutions that could collect or manage this information. For example, in Costa Rica's case, but of course, that's supplemented with the participation of other institutions that have the ability to participate in the sector. In this case, we have MIVA, Instituto Nacional of Housing in Costa Rica, and Banco, the bank, which are the three institutions that have participation in this. And of course, cooperative management. Here we have some recommendations. I'm not going to stay here long, but basically talk about the importance this land offer may have on changing the marketplace. We're talking about public leadership with efficiency and understanding what are the procedures to do so, also thinking in the future scenarios and a series of strengthening of capabilities that can work in modifying how the market works, always with an integrated urban policy that is very clear, but also mobilizing the land. These tools are very important, and we need to use a methodology that can work here to mobilize this. And here we have some cases such as parking spaces or buildings, which is another thing. We shouldn't talk just about land. We should also talk about buildings. So I would stop here just to say that this study was coordinated by Marcela Roman in San Jose, and it will be available and published by CEPAL on our urban platform. And thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Diego. I will keep your message of there is public land, which is the main element to be able to develop these mechanisms to generate social interest housing, and that we need to take into account the soils, the land, and the various levels of the state. We're also going to be waiting for these publications so that we can see in more detail this very successful methodology in Costa Rica. Thank you very much, Diego. So now we're going to have our second speaker, Maria Cristina Gomez Jurado, who is the General Manager of Public Company Metropolitana de Hábitat y Vivienda in Quito, Ecuador. Hi, Maria Cristina, how are you? It's a pleasure to have you here. Good morning, Diego and Paloma. I'm pleased to be here to talk a little bit about the experiences, practical experiences of the things that are being said in this type of things. I think this is very enriching, and I think that the example of what's happened in the habitat company is really a big example of what we are talking about in this space. I think it is very interesting. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of these concepts and see the reality of what's happening with housing when we have a public operator, and then possibilities that opens and presents.
Sí, se ve perfecto. Adelante, María Cristina.
Buenísimo, gracias. Bueno, en primer lugar,
Okay, so first of all, the company was established in 2010 to execute the policies for enablement of the land, a land offer, urbanization, and housing promotion, specifically destined for households that had the very first house for social interest, low-income families, households, and vulnerable families that were in a risk situation. It also had attributions on the urban improvement, but these were not the elements that it was focused on. It was really focused on new houses. The company inherited a unit within an executing company that was public-private back then at the beginning of the 2000s. We still had these public-private companies that are not existing anymore in Quito since 2008 or 9. This is a 100% public company, as all municipal companies. And also, besides some commercial housing projects, most of the projects that the company started were about relocation. To that sense, then, the company starts with this big financial burden, which is relocation projects that had to be leveraged with these projects for commercialization. We're going to be talking about the commercialization projects. I would like to focus my presentation of Ciudad Bicentenario, which is a project that started at the beginning of the 2000s. You see on the right, where it says Proyecto Ciudad Bicentenario. It's an area that is away from Quito, and it's coming closer and closer. And the Victoria del Sur in the south end. Even though they are urban areas, they are really far from the areas that are uh, commonly used for living. It is not the ideal location, but we're not talking about really displaced housing projects. Ciudad Bicentenario is a project that is a big scale project that plans over 2,000 housing in 31 blocks. 26 of these houses were developed through municipal development, and 4 of these blocks are managed through cooperatives. That was a very interesting model too. The property goes to a cooperative, and these housing cooperatives are the ones that develop that. So it is also an interesting thing here. My first stage of the project with 19 blocks started being executed in 2008. The approval of the ordinance on buying the land was before this company existed, and it happened at the beginning of the 2000s, and then it ends in 2011 when the company had already been established, and then the second one starts in 2011 and ends in 2019. It has some specific characteristics that make it successful in terms of public policy and access to housing, but financially speaking, it has some characteristics that make the operation kind of complex. And we have Victoria del Sur. It's a project that was planned with 15 blocks, 10 of which were for social interest housing and also commercial. They could even have public interest housing that are kind of more costly but have they give better financial returns to the company, and 5 blocks for relocation. It is important to mention that what was built for the last years were the relocation houses, which are not the ones that have financial returns to the company, but a high tax burden. And the last commercial block is block number 7 that has 120 houses. And due to several administrative things, it was finished in 2019, but we just started selling it over a little bit less than 1 year ago or 8 months, and we have been selling that with current prices, and that has generated some problems, and also noticed how the housing public policy by property does not solve access to housing for a big number of people. So this is kind of a summary of these two projects that have commercial houses, and we also have in Victoria del Sur, we have 120 commercial houses, and we are commercializing 60 buildings. It is really successful if we take into account the economic and real estate scenario and how that is moving in this economic conflict and Ecuador is going through. So this is a big project that has 1,132 developments, and we are having some difficulties. Most of the houses have not been built in Bicentenario, which is an older project that, from my perspective, is more successful because we built over 2,000 houses, and we still have 2 or 3 blocks, and most of them have been already finished. In terms of construction, Ciudad Bicentenario was through a different kind of lease. We had very low prices, $10,000, because we sold them in 2008. The land was not incorporated in the price of the houses, only the construction, not other indirect costs like that are covered by the municipality. municipality. So it has a subsidy that is very strong, but it's not really, like broken down. And in the current framework is really risky to do this type of mechanism is really risky with the legal framework that we have now. And I think it is very important to have the participation of housing cooperatives. But Victoria del Sur, since it has had, it's been such a long time, and we're just starting selling that. The thing is that we are within what the Equatorian regulation establishes as social interest housing. We're selling them from $35,000 to $45,000, which is the cheapest price in the market. But we are seeing how many families, households cannot do that. We have 10,000 households that are interested, and only 60 can finish that due to the informality of the income. Basically, be, the complex of the complexity of mortgage credits, having access to these credits, I mean, in the country. So we see this historical mismatch. The man demands for cheaper products and the offer cannot, because of the cost of the land, the urbanization cost, the cost of many of the associated costs to the housing development, they cannot meet that demand. And that makes us rethink a lot about the mechanism of holding a housing. Historically, in Ecuador and Quito is really focused on property. In the private market, we do have rents and all that, but in the public policy, it is focused on property, which generates other conflicts that will not allow us as a municipality to actually meet the demand. We have a new legal framework. They appoint the agent that is like the land manager, and one of the powers is to manage the land bank. And considering that they already have these powers as the managers of social interest housings, then they become this land operator, a public one, that allows to generate uh, accessible housing. That is good within the legal terms and within the beginnings of a regulatory framework. But when you come to reality, then you have some difficulties that we're going to see in some specific cases. So the organic law for ordenamiento territorial is a national law, talks about land banking and this municipal estate of a private domain that will have to be destined for public, that can be transferred and rented and have some other rights that will be aligned to planning. And the plan of use and management of land starts talking about municipal and private estate that have to be used for the have to be used according to the law. And these are some of the main regulatory frameworks that give us power to use that. Because yes, we have a lot of municipal land, public, municipal, and national soil land, but mobilization is complex in terms of there is a lot of taxes on some of the properties. They are regulatory difficulties. They are risky locations. When it comes to execute that, it is not that easy. And one of the things that makes it difficult to have this mobilization is costs. Quito's cadastre reflects the reality of the prices, and for some objectives is very useful. For example, when it comes to uh, collecting the taxes that will reflect the benefits these private lands receive. But when it comes to transacting the public land, it has cadastre values that are really close to the other ones. That makes it hard to have this land use as because we're forced to do the recovery of the value. We are forced to recover the cadastre values of the
Eso
so that we don't have to accept the patrimony of the government. So that creates some difficulties. So planning does not mean gives us these tools that are called the urbanistic acting units that are very well located inside the city, and they have to be built only one single enabling process to guarantee the rational use of the land so that these pieces of lands in the city are developed completely. And so here we see a little map of 23 of the units that have our urbanistic act units. Most of them are private. And the company has plays a role on this management of this. So we have two big opportunities, which is these two pieces of land that we can see in the green circle. Two of these units are public municipal land and they belong to the company. In this YX station, it is one of very interesting cases that because it was a station that was used as a yard for cars, a car lot, and then we transfer the property to housing so that we can modify and start putting all this transformation. And the other one is the urbanistic unit, which is an ordinance for housing. The land was donated to the company for housing, but has new conditions. As you can see, especially why they are very, very well located, but that also has some meanings regarding cost of land. So very quickly, to tell you what these units are about, what they have told me is that you have this land. For you to be able to use it, you need to consolidate certain general provisions. We have a better regulation, however, that applies to public and private fees. To have access to this better regulation, we have to be responsible for some percentage of the charges. So we have these charges and these benefits, and we incorporate the social interest housing. So the company, what the company does is they place these two roles to guarantee these burdens and benefits as the promoter and the owner of the land. So from the land, we had this here that was empty to the left. The urban proposal incorporates several things, and one of the things that we are incorporating right now in these operations that we're proposing here we see how this land is completely vacant. Is the incorporation of renting this social interest housing. It's almost non-existent. In the last century, we didn't have many examples, but I think it is important to go back to this to avoid incorporating the price of the land in the final product of the housing. But it would allow us to make the house affordable in a good location, especially with good quality, which is important. This is a first proposal for that piece of land. Yes, we are planning some houses. The land will be made available to the private company, to the private market with these new alliances that we have. But here we incorporated 90 social interest houses. And the interesting thing is that we have a mechanism of burdens and benefits. But here we have like a brief proposal as to how we would do that, and an exercise of the residual value of the land that generates some profitability to the company and will allow them to manage these renting processes. The same thing happens to the J Estación also. This is a more expensive land, and we are proposing that a whole land becomes public building, and the rest of the land will be made available to the estate market for any business they would like to make it. But in this sense, this is how we would leverage this. And in the proposal, we are keeping some land for social interest renting, 50 house units. This is a better located place, and we are aiming to having some housing solutions for renting in this sector. Here we have some social and economic information about the housing deficit. So we say that there is a qualitative and a quantitative deficit that we also need to approach. It is 25,000 houses, and we also see that 52% of the households receive income that is lower than $800 a month, so they cannot have access to a 50,000 a house, which is what Victoria de Sul we found there. Basic lands will not give you access to 35, 40, 45,000 dollars. So they are considered social interest houses. So it is really complicated in this scenario. So we ran another analysis of the price of the land. So we have very few projects, 1% of the total number of projects that have an offer for housing that is lower than $50,000. Very few units. This represents only 639 units, and in general, the construction prices are not lower than $800 per square meter. That makes it completely unaffordable. So how do we face this reality? And for example, the cadastre value in Chilo Gallo is $73 per square meter, which is low. But the estimated value is going to be $700 the square meter, which is out of the possibilities for the people. In J, we're talking about a cadastre value of $600 per square meter, so it's completely unaffordable. Incorporating that value to the price of the land, to the house, these are general prices. It is not that the projects have consolidated, but we are estimating some values of $1,400, $1,600 per square meter, and it is completely different markets. And that's why we're so interested in these alternative mechanisms to have access to housing. First of all, social renting, which I think is considered as part of the regulation of the organic law for social interest housing, and that is an interest that we need to develop at the local level, and we're working on that. And we're also working in a project of renting houses in the historical center on Calle 24 de Mayo, which we want to turn into a pilot. Those are the pictures that we see to the right. This is a houses that belong to the company. This is just a land, because what we're doing right now is to take the land and to create like a pilot for social interest renting houses. So the cost of improving a house is a lot bigger, it's a lot higher. So we think that the exercise to make it commercial, making commercial housing that is affordable, well located, is really complex. That's why we're aiming at renting, which does not exist locally. And we also have the legal framework that offers us the right of the surface, which is what Alvaro mentioned at the beginning, that gives us power to transfer through a third party, not the land, but the right to build there for 50, 60 years, whatever long it was. And it also allows us to have an operation that is, get that price of the land of the operation, and it allows the operation to be private, so it will not become a public thing. So the administrative burden that is necessary will generate the renting, social renting. Here we have like a structure uh, of the models to manage that we are management models that we are setting for social renting on the surface, right? And I don't think it is necessary to go deep into this because of time constraints, but this is what we are doing as a company. So I just wanted to tell you about this reality that we are facing in terms of generating housing in this model and the options that we are working on. that are not easy, that will take time, and they need some institutional arrangements that we have already started working on. We have regulations, we have laws, but we continues to be not enough when it comes to time to mobilizing the land, and we could working on that. And it's kind of up the hill because those are slow processes that take time to become visible and be sold politically outwards.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. And with you, we move on to the third block. We have 4 questions. I'm going to ask a question to each of the participants. The first one, let's start with you, Maria Cristina. The question reads, Maria mentioned that the companies were private and public, but now they are only public. Where do you get the financing from? And does it cover your projects or is it separate? Since we are a little late, I would like for you to answer in just 1 minute. Today, the Habitat company receives financing from commercial housing, but in Bicentenario, the prices were very low to offer access, and we had all of those problems. Right now, we depend on municipal allocations. Now, based on these instruments that I told you about, is to have charges, equitable charges and benefit. We will have land with better regulation, enabled land, depending on the arrangements that we depending on the arrangements we make with the private sector. We have other financing mechanisms, maybe a tax on property that is not being used. We are analyzing it. Thank you very much. The second question is for Natalia. Eva Campos wants to know what experiences could Natalia share in terms of costs and challenges of the administration and how to transform public land in social renting. Well, since we have very few experiences here in the country, transforming real estate in social housing, for example, in urban downtown with retrofit or reurbanization, the associated costs, for example, for seismic buildings, we see that Latin America has started a discussion on how to optimize that topic. We can be very rigid so that we can have buildings under the best standards, but those buildings in the city have been there for 50 years and they have not been used and they generate more problems than benefits. So that is one of the discussions that we have, which are very important. And that those are some of the situations that we have to solve in the region in terms of reusing buildings. A while ago, I worked for an entity that managed the district's land bank. And since this is very similar to what Maria Cristina shared in Quito, since these are decentralized entities that have certain legal conditions, that implies that they have to pay taxes like any other owner. In other words, we have to pay housing taxes, and the pressure from managing the soil. We have experience that shows that we bought the land very cheap. And 10 years later, the soil had increased the prices and the projects were complex. And Now we see how there can be some tax exceptions in terms of the land for the use of those buildings that generate resources and that those projects can be developed. And the more buildings we have parked, as we say in Colombia, but let's say that these buildings generate costs that we have to pay for, and we need to see where the resources would come from. Many of the issues that we see in the country, we see control entities. Thank you, Natalia. The third question is for Diego. Washington Fajardo wonders about the regulation of these processes, and this is the question. How can the municipality take into consideration buying public land in urban centers where high costs impact the budget because the quality of the land and the transparency is deficient? Hiciste hasta las I-10. Thank you, Paloma. What we developed in Costa Rica was that we wanted to address the feasibility that the soil that we know as public may be used for social housing. First, information is all over the place. Second, once you consolidate the information, we need to understand who's going to manage it. And third, not all of the land can be used. We established some 4 to 5 specific examples of land that could be used in terms of how many houses would be built. So that's one of the inequities, the lack of information and not having centralized information. Let's remember that what's perfect is the enemy of what is good. The fact that we consolidate information, and some colleagues have given some examples, this implies that we can go ahead with certain projects, taking into consideration that land is not the property of a few. We talked about an institute, a land that belongs to the Institute of Social Security. This is an independent institution that has its own assets, and we would need to have it transfer, and it cannot be done for free. But the idea is that the soil has to be valued according to the use. We could not value the land for social housing at a value that is so expensive that then we have to allocate it for social housing. Maria Cristina told us exactly the difficulties we have in terms of having an effective demand, because this type of housing is not quite affordable. So the question is, what is the best entity that has the vocation to consolidate these lands so that we can have a managed portfolio that is owned by the state and that it will have to be consolidated? Thank you, Diego. And now a question for Álvaro. Robin Rajak would like to know if the government would compensate owners if they lose money in a development that they have to build, because they would get a penalty for not developing the lands. I don't know if you have any example in the case of Bilbao on how to do these compensations. I don't know if I understood the question, but there is a clear case of the Arellano Towers, 2,000 social housing, or they're not social housing, though they are protected housing. So when the land was assigned, they did a very important economic study. And when the land is assigned and the developers have a specific amount of time to build, it is true that the developer acquires a certain risk, but the idea is that this can be done within a time frame where the materials cost and the building cost doesn't negatively impact the development. They had 3 years for the development. I don't know any case where the private party had to be compensated for having lost money in a project such as the one that you're mentioning. You have to do a good financial study. You have to start with good conditions. What is the maximum price of the housing? And as with any other project, it is private and they have a good planning. I don't know if I answered your question. I think you did, Alvaro. Thank you very much. And with this, we close the webinar. But before closing, I would like to ask each of the speakers and panelists if they could summarize with one word what they think is the most important thing to generate land for social housing. That's a difficult challenge. At the beginning, I said innovation. Innovation applied to management. Innovation, yes. Thank you, Alvaro.
Yo tomaría la segunda que iba a decir Álvaro y es gestión. Creo
I
que
would say management.
lo que necesitamos
I
es
think is
tener
what we
gestión.
need to move forward. Management. Thank you, Natalia. Diego. Coordination and vision. Coordination and vision amongst institutions. They took my ideas, but I think vision is important. We need to have a vision of what we want to achieve. Well, thank you, everyone. And with this, I will give the floor to Paloma Silva, who will help us close this webinar with some conclusions. Thank you, Paloma. Well, again, this was a total success. I would like to thank all of the panelists for their valuable perspectives. Also, Paloma Acevedo for moderating this second webinar. I think the experiences and the knowledge they have are fundamental for the success of this webinar. Thank you, participants, for your active participation because you enrich our discussion. Today, we discussed the importance of generating affordable land for social housing in the cities. Right now, I am in Guatemala, and in every country in the region, I find there are a lot of subsidy programs to take care of the housing needs. Nonetheless, there is not enough supply, and the challenge through the study that we have done in 10 countries in the region leads us to say that we need affordable, well-located land, not only for housing solutions, but also for urban infrastructure, health infrastructure. Natalia and Alvaro have given us valuable solutions to create land banks and the implementation of innovative urban policies. Alvaro, I met you about 10 years ago, and we saw how the Bilbao regeneration was done with the public and private sector. We also learned how these strategies can optimize land use and optimize accessible housing, improving the quality of life of urban residents and promoting a sustainable urban development. I would like to highlight the key learnings from the practical cases that we saw today. In terms of San Jose, Costa Rica, presented by Diego, Chief of Human Settlement Department, he highlighted how implementing urban land policies has allowed for better planning with available land at CEPAL. We have a cross-cutting group that we have driven with Diego to have an information repository on housing, and we are also working with them to modernize the housing surveys and the housing deficit survey. And we are also working on practical cases such as the one in Costa Rica. And I think that the experience in San Jose highlights the importance of effective management of urban land for equitable and sustainable urban development. Also, thank you, Maria Cristina Gomez Jurado, manager of Habitat Department in Ecuador, who shared the Quito experience in implementing successful projects to generate urban development. Maria Cristina highlighted strategies to promote affordable housing for the vulnerable sectors, focusing on creating effective and sustainable public policy. And without a doubt, these projects have improved the access to decent housing, but also to have a sustainable urban development. When we do these webinars with the IDB and the housing group, we think how it would be worth generating capacities or exporting best practices in the region and in other regions of the world, so that relevant actors such as local authorities, such as national authorities, and with the private sector, they can collaborate to achieve sustainable, equitable urban development. And without a doubt, as you remember, last week, we addressed some policies such as regulations, redensification programs, and today we discussed new ideas. Well, the thing is that each one of you should find different ways of doing things, and that you tropicalize it for each of your countries so that we can have more affordable land for the good of everyone. I would like to invite you to the next webinar, webinar number 3, titled Optimization of Subsidies for the Development of Sustainable Housing Solutions, which will take place next Wednesday, June 5th. And please fill out the survey that you will see on the screen through the QR code or through the link that we have in the chat. Your comments are very important to us, and we will give feedback to do webinars focusing on the specific needs of our audience. Please get in touch with the IDB team if you have any additional questions. Thank you very much for your time and participation, and have a great day.
Muchas gracias, gracias a todos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, un
Muchas gracias. Feliz
saludo.
día para todas y para todos.